Good evening and welcome to class, everybody. My name is William Green, and tonight I will be presenting the lecture on The Union is Dissolved. Now, December 20th of 1860, voted unanimously, 167 votes to none. The state of South Carolina would decide to secede from the Union, becoming the first state to secede from the Union. But before we get to December 20th of 1860, we need to take a step back and evaluate the framework that was provided by one of the state's most notable politicians, that being John C. Calhoun. Now, Calhoun provided a model of nullification in the late 1820s, early 1830s that we've already discussed earlier in the course. But as well, Calhoun provides the concept of a compact theory of the Constitution. Now, while Calhoun doesn't originate this concept, we actually see the originator being Jefferson in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798. However, Calhoun provides an application for South Carolina to utilize this, as he argues in his 1840 in his speech on the inclusion of the state of California into the Union, that if the slavery question remains untouched, that the state of South Carolina will be left with no other option than to leave the Union, because the Union cannot stand if the slavery question continues to be bothered, as the South will feel as though that their rights and their needs are not being met, exemplifying Calhoun's concurrent majority, basically meaning that the South needed to come together to defend its rights, or its right to what they considered a constitutionally protected right of slavery. Now, we see Calhoun dies in 1850, and with that, when the Southern Convention of 1850 happens, it really doesn't gain any traction. We see the Compromise of 1850, and really the Fugitive Slave Act seemed to appease the South long enough just for things to go a little bit weird again. Now, get to 1858, and this new party has come onto the scene. They were created in 1856, but the Republican Party, running on a platform of abolition, even if it was just for westward expansion, it was still a party that was running on the concept of ending slavery, which was the realization of the threats that Calhoun had made, that the slavery question would always be bothered until eventually either it was constitutionally protected or you see people going after it. Now, Lincoln would state in the Lincoln-Douglas debates that a house divided cannot stand, and that we cannot serve two masters. Basically, what it's going to end up happening is the nation will either be entirely free or it will be entirely slave, but we cannot continue to go down this path. This is important, as this argument is articulated throughout the disunionist fire eater newspapers, who are spreading reports that Lincoln is a black Republican. Now, this is basically meaning that Lincoln is going to come to take your slaves, even though Lincoln himself really didn't see Southern slavery as something to go after at this point. However, the meteor of the movement comes in with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. With John Brown's raid, this is one of the first times that we actually see violence being used to advocate for abolition. Once again, meeting the paranoia of the South, making them realize that they don't have a choice, or at least in their mindset that they don't have a choice, that their way of life is being attacked, and that they don't have the wherewithal to truly go to protect the institution of slavery in the federal government, as the free states have created a consolidated majority. Therefore, we see in April of 1860, when the Democratic National Convention of 1860 was held in Charleston, in hopes to appease the Southern Democrat, that they would elect Stephen Douglas, the man who had beat Lincoln in the Senate in the senatorial campaign against him, and also the champion of the Compromise of 1850, that if the South would elect Douglas, the Democratic Party would have someone who ran on a concept of popular sovereignty, but would not truly address the slave issue. Because Douglas refused to address the slave issue directly, the South cast their vote with John Breckinridge, the incumbent vice president. Now, this incumbent vice president, John Breckinridge, he's not really, he's a Southerner, he's a slave owner. It makes sense. But we know what happens when you split a party's vote. The North voted for, or Northern Democrats voted for Stephen Douglas, Southern Democrats voted for John Breckinridge, and Lincoln was actually left off the ballot in 10 states, including the state of South Carolina. So when Lincoln wins the election of 1860 with 37% of the popular vote, South Carolina sees this as the election of a tyrant who's coming after their way of life. They even state that they believe that come the time of his inauguration, that their constitutional rights will be dissolved. Therefore, they are moved to accelerate their clock towards secession. Now, we get to December 20th. The secessionist campaign was actually supposed to be held in Columbia, but there was a smallpox epidemic, and they moved it down to Charleston. 167 men walked down the streets of Charleston to Institute Hall, where they would walk in order alphabetically by county, and they would sign the Ordinance of Secession. The Charleston Mercury read the next day that the Union is dissolved, advertising this moment of truly breaking the constitutional compact that had been created at the time that the Constitution was ratified. In the reasoning for the Ordinance of Secession, the delegates from South Carolina stated that they believed that their rights as a state and their right to interposition had been violated, and that their right to maintain their role in the nation was something that they didn't want to do anymore. And this was primarily due to the fact that they believed that, one, their needs were not being met. And they moved forward with this secession movement. And in the ordinance and the reasons for secession, they clearly state that the institution of slavery was a predominant reason, and that the failure to protect this institution and the continuous agitation, along with the election of a man who they believed would be tyrannical, led them to secede from the Union. Now, we see where very quickly the city of Charleston is celebrating, the state of South Carolina is celebrating. There's a man stationed on Fort Moultrie. His name's Major Robert Anderson. He decides that at this point that he is fearing for the safety of his men. So on December 26th, under the cover of night, he moves his troops across the harbor to the half-finished star-shaped fort built in the design of Fort McHenry up in Baltimore, Fort Sumter. Now, as he moves his men to Fort Sumter, this is seen as an act of aggression, and Charleston runs a blockade in the harbor. We're going to see where on January 9th of 1861, the federal government tried to send a resupply ship under the guise of a merchant vessel known as the Star of the West Citadel cadets opened fire on the Star of the West. It was 3 volleys sent over the bow of the ship, never made contact. But those 3 shots over the bow of the ship are where we actually get that red South Carolina state flag. It's called Big Red. And it's Citadel cadets trying to say that they were the ones who shot the first shots of the Civil War. Now, this can't quite be the case because a military academy can't start a war because they're not truly a oppositional force. The Confederacy would not be founded until February 19th of 1861, so you really can't have a war between the Confederacy and the Union at this point in January. However, on April 9th of 1861, we see where General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard, better known as PGT Beauregard, is going to tell his former instructor at West Point, Major Robert Anderson, that he is going to open fire within 36 hours. Now, the reason for this is because he knows that there's a resupply ship on its way, and that if the federal troops are resupplied with men, goods, or whatever, they're not going to be able to take the fort. Now, with that in mind, next week's lesson we will be discussing the actual firing on Fort Sumter. I hope you all enjoyed and have a wonderful night.